By training and experience, I'm a geologist, and in the course of doing field mapping, quite often geologists will identify a distinctive plant associated with an outcrop belt. One of the main examples that I encountered was in mapping pure shale outcrops along the Missouri Trench. One particular unit, the Sharon Springs member, would have very distinctive plants on it, and it helped, in our mapping, it helped identify those outcrop belts. So that's the source of the inspiration, sort of. I'm going to show you half a dozen examples of sage and cedar and other tallgrass prairie plants associated with specific sites. I'm going to show you half a dozen examples from Good Earth State Park, just outside of Sioux Falls, and that's in South Dakota, and across the Big Sioux River in Iowa, there is the Blood Run National Historic Landmark, and I'll show you some examples from there. The recipe we actually encountered on our family farm, it's about 30 miles to the east of Sioux Falls. We have a number of identified archaeology sites on the farm, and most of those have remnant prairie plants, tallgrass prairie plants associated with the specific sites. We also saw an association of circular vegetation anomalies that we tested with gradiometry, and some of them were cache pits and some of them were dwellings. But I'm going to focus on the plants, not just the grasses, but the forbs, the wildflowers as well, and the artifacts. I have a friend at Flandreau, Avery Jones, who's a linguist and a traditional knowledge person, and a lot of this perspective comes from him. But we also had THPO down from the Upper Sioux Agency, Samantha Odegaard, and then an elder came down and looked at the lay of the land and the sites, and his name was Dennis Gill. I should also say at the park manager, Jim Henning, and the park naturalist, Jen Stahl, were really helpful and provided some information that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. There are a lot of Native American cultures that have in their tradition 4 plants: tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, and cedar. Tobacco is kind of an issue because mixtures are used. I don't know anything about sweetgrass. I know some people that raise it, but I don't know what the setting is in nature. Cedar and sage are pretty easy to distinguish in the field, but they're both regarded as weeds, so they don't very often go into seed mixes that are used for reconstructing prairie, and that can be a help for what we're doing. This is the north end of Good Earth. There's a reconstructed prairie on a former cropland surface, upland surface, and then in the area around, in the slope area around, there's a remnant prairie, and that remnant prairie extends down onto the floodplain. And the floodplain, there's an archaeological site that has been worked up, but it isn't related to the Oneota tradition on the Iowa side. It's a great oasis, so it's older. We got to start with the geology on everything, yeah? The upland surface where the restored or reconstructed prairie is located is on glacial drift, and that glacial drift is under the slope, and the adjacent fan at the foot of the slope is colluvium that's washed off the slope. Down onto the floodplain, that's alluvium deposited by the river. But then the slope fan floodplain association that's where the remnant prairie is, because you couldn't get the machinery in to do the cropping. But on the upland surface, those old crop fields have been restored. The Heath site's located on the fan and the adjacent floodplain, and that's where we'll start out. So this is remnant prairie, the wild plum and the sunflower. There's some prairie grasses in there that are native, but there's also a lot of brome. It's a degraded prairie. And back off in the distance, you can see that white sage turning around and walking up the slope, and then looking down onto the site. You can see there's lots of sage down there on the site. Here's a little closer view of sage. The upper right, that single plant is a sage that was probably not part of the seed used to restore the prairie. So maybe it's part of a preserved seed bank, an old preserved seed bank. In the lower left, there's a glacial erratic that's been identified as a sacred site by, I think it was Randy Tebow, who was the THPO for the Ponca. And in the background, those white spears are sage. So there's sage associated with this feature on the remnant prairie. And I was really interested in the quartzite. That's a Sioux quartzite, which is a common rock of the Sioux Falls area. I was interested in that as maybe being a sacred site because it had sage marking it, but the park management put that boulder in there to control traffic. So that is, that's not necessarily, that's not necessarily the pattern that I'm trying to tell you about. Going across the river to Blood Run, there's a spring that's been identified as a ceremonial area. The people that, there've been a number of people that identified it, but Lance Foster, who was the THPO for the Iowa tribes of Kansas and Nebraska, and Stacy Larvey, who was THPO for the Ponca. Both of those two people I know have looked at this site and indicated that it was probably a ceremonial site. But the settler who lived there built a house over the spring, and that foundation, he built the house right over the spring because, you know, inside running water, a pump in the basement. That foundation you can see in the distance with the sage associated with the general area. Maybe the settler used the sage for landscape like you see around modern buildings, but I doubt that. Maybe it's erupted from a preserved seed bank, or maybe it's the indication that this is a ceremonial site and that sage was used as part of the ceremonies. That foundation is no longer there. The state of Iowa is trying to restore that area. And earlier this week, the foundation was removed and the site smoothed. There's another specific feature in the overall Blood Run National Historic Landmark. There's a low knoll that has cultural material on the top, and this lower left shows some of the remnant prairie on the margins of the knoll. There's a sweet clover in the front that's evasive, and there's smooth brome in there, but you can see on the skyline some big blue stems sticking up and some cedar as well in the lower right-hand corner and up on the skyline. Walking up to the top of the knoll where the cultural material is actually located, we have sage right at that spot. This is on the reconstructed prairie in Blood Run. There's a lot of it. There's, in addition to the grasses, there's sunflower in there, and you can see last year's coneflower. This is near the smaller of the two mound groups at Blood Run, but across the creek and over basically into this area here, the major mound group is located. And we've highlighted the mounds here. They're pretty subtle. When you're out there, you could see them. But here's two of them that have sage directly on the mounds. And I've been told that the single plants on the left that are on the south side of the mound also has ceremonial significance. So now we'll come back to the South Dakota side of the Big Sioux. In the southern part of the park, there's a complex of new trails associated with almost 100 acres of reconstructed prairie. The old photograph on the right is where it's in the remnant prairie where they did a plant inventory and identified a number of tallgrass prairie plants, including sage and cedar, and of course big blue stem and a lot of the others that are common in a remnant prairie setting. The map on the left is the reconstructed prairie on, again, this is a relatively flat upland that was part of a cropping system and now has been planted to different areas, different communities, including Indian grass, big blue stem and switchgrass, and I'm not sure what the mixtures are for the other two. But no sage or cedar seeds are included in those seedings. The red circle is an archaeological site that we'll visit and see what plants are there. This is the remnant prairie from the inventory area. You can see cedar and big blue stem and that sage plant. That plant next to the sage, this one is probably a native forb, but I'm not sure what the name of it is. I really tried to tune into the sage because it was so diagnostic, or so easy to see, and also the cedar. But there was another forb, wildflower, in the remnant prairie and also included in the mixture up on the reconstructed prairie. That blossom is wild bergamot, and Jerome Killsplenty is an elder that I think used to be associated with USD, said that bergamot is something that the Dakota use as part of mourning. But in contrast to the sage, there was bergamot in the remnant prairie and bergamot seed in the reconstruction. So it's less significant than the sage because there was no, or the cedar, but the sage, there was no sage seed included in the reconstructed prairie. So let's look at the reconstructed prairie. We're now at that archaeological site. The reconstructed prairie is to the right of the trail, and there's sage in there. The site is back at that first tree, and we'll walk down the trail. So now we're at the site, there's the tree, and there's also sage not only in the reconstructed prairie, but in the remnant prairie as well. Now, the trees in back of us, and we're looking at the site on the reconstructed prairie, and there's a difference in which prairie grasses. There's two different planted prairie grasses there. The tall red ones in back are big blue stem, and I think this is Indian grass, the fluffy stuff in front. And it pretty much approximates the location of the arc site. There's also a patch of thistles in there, and they're quite often associated with disturbed soil. The material that was recovered at that site the material ties the site across the river to the Oneota cultural components on the Iowa side. The tablet on the upper left there is one that's at the Center for Western Studies in Augustana, but it was collected on the Iowa side, and there are numerous tablets over there and in other Oneota cultural associations that are scribed. And this tablet is the one that was recovered from the southern part of Good Earth, particularly struck by the similar motif in the buffalo hoofs. There's also a bunch of demotage at this site on the South Dakota side that is a real diagnostic lithology called the Bijou Hills orthoquartzite. And there's lots of Bijou Hills on the Iowa side as well. So here's an example closer to Vermillion. This is the Spirit Mound Historical Prairie north of town. And it's got reconstructed prairie over most of the property, but there's remnant prairie on the sides of this mound. It's been identified as a significant ceremonial site from the Lewis and Clark journals. Walking around the mound, you don't see basically any sage or cedar until you get up to the top, and on the northeast corner of the mound, near where there's a bedrock exposure, there's both sage and cedar. So, correlation isn't causation. I don't know why those things are co-located, but one possibility is that there's an ancient seed bank with viable seeds, and if the conditions are right, those tallgrass prairie species erupt. That wouldn't necessarily explain why it's associated with archaeological sites. Human activity might be another reason why the sage is where it is. Probably not associated with the planting, but reconstructed prairies, but it might have been from leftover from ceremonies. And even in the reconstructed prairies, the example of the Indian grass and the big blue stem surrounding that site, once there's a signal, once there's a signature in the soil and in the seed bank, that helps us, could help us identify archaeology sites. Or if you're interested in mapping remnant prairie, maybe you should start with the known archaeology sites and go see if there's remnant prairie there, if that's your business. On the other hand, if you're looking for archaeology sites, it'd be a good idea to tune into what native plants are in that area, because that might be an indicator for a site. That business of using artifacts to protect plants, that's a perspective that I got from Mark Parker, who was part of the Omaha THPO, he pointed out that the prairies wouldn't have been reconstructed at either Good Earth or Blood Run if we didn't know that there was cultural significance there, that there were artifacts. So in effect, the artifacts were protecting the plants, offering a reason for the plants to come back. The other alternative is using the plants to protect the artifacts. The reconstructed prairie protects the artifacts, or the thing that sort of drove this whole horseback look. We're in conversation on our farm, we're in conversation with the Nature Conservancy in the state of Minnesota about a grassland conservation easement. Grassland conservation easements have been used to protect archaeological sites, or attempted to be used to protect archaeological sites in Minnesota. But a cultural easement is apparently a pretty rare thing. I used, for better or for worse, AI Google searches. North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, nothing turned up looking for a conservation easement on the basis of cultural resources. The state of Iowa has a conservation easement for archaeology, but it's not an incentive, it's thou shalt not sort of thing. The state of Wisconsin has an incentive for cultural easement, for protection of cultural resources. They give a break in the property tax. And as I said, in Minnesota, particularly in the Jeffers area, the Red Rock Ridge area in southwestern Minnesota, they're trying to use grassland easements similar to the ones that we're working with for our farm to protect the arc sites that are there. If you all know of some precedent for a conservation easement for cultural resources, I'd really appreciate hearing about it. Because in the Midwest, they don't seem to be too common, but maybe there's some precedent in other parts of the U.S. And that's all I've got.